The mountains of Armenia rose like watchful sentinels against the vast skies, their jagged silhouettes etched in fire during dawn and shrouded in violet mist by dusk. In this land of granite and spirit, where kingdoms flourished and vanished like morning frost on sacred stones, the Arthacid dynasty carved a fragile order from centuries of turmoil. Amid this patchwork of tribal loyalties, Roman incursions and Parthian whispers, Sandukht ascended to the throne, not by birthright alone, but by the sheer gravity of his political cunning. His lineage claimed from the blood of kings and the tempered force of necessity. He inherited a realm that lay precariously between empires, a jewel desired by both Rome and Parthia, a crucible of faiths and fire. The gods of old still walked in Armenia, not in flesh, but in the fires tended on high altars, in the echoes of Zoroastrian priests who whispered chants from beyond the Oxus River. Sandukht, stern and deliberate, knew his kingdom's fate hung in balance. He must not only hold the land but hold the hearts of its people. He ruled with the sword in one hand and a chalice of calculated diplomacy in the other. In the 3rd year of his reign, during a harvest that bore sweet apricots and blood-warm figs from the valley of Ararat, his queen gave birth to a daughter. She came into the world as a storm raged outside the stone-walled palace, lightning clawing the heavens above Mount Aragats. The midwives whispered that the child's arrival during such a tempest foretold a destiny both cursed and divine. Sandukht, upon first seeing her swaddled in crimson silk, did not smile. He studied her face, the soft curve of her jaw, the quiet intensity in her eyes even then, and named her Sandukht. He had wished for a son. A male heir could be molded into a prince, taught the art of war, trained in the alchemy of survival in a volatile land. But something in Sandukht unsettled him even as an infant. She bore the stillness of the mountains, not blank or empty, but ancient, absorbing. Her silence was not weakness. It was prelude. The court astrologers spoke of eclipses and the conjunction of stars. Some warning of upheaval, others prophesying illumination. Sandukht listened as he always did, but locked those omens away in the steel vault of his reason. As Sandukht grew, she revealed none of the softness the court expected of royal daughters. She wandered the palace gardens not to pick roses, but to question why the birds migrated differently each season. She lingered beside the sages of the court, absorbing languages, learning philosophy, and even eavesdropped on the debates between military captains and merchants. She was not rebellious in the vulgar sense. She obeyed her tutors, answered her father with respect, wore the ceremonial robes without complaint. But she carried a presence that resisted shaping, a gravity that pulled those around her into reflection or discomfort. The high priest of the fire temple once described her to Sandukht not as a girl, but as a mirror. She reflected back the intentions and desires of those who gazed upon her, not because she tried to, but because she saw. It was said she could look into the heart of a man and leave him questioning his worth. Sandukht dismissed such poetic nonsense publicly, but deep in his mind it took root like ivy on stone. He had her educated in the traditions of the kingdom, Zoroastrian doctrine, the genealogies of kings, the sacred rites of fire and water. She mastered them with precision but never passion. When asked to recite prayers at the altars, she spoke the words, but her eyes wandered to the skies. The priests warned her father in hushed tones. The girl understands the rituals but does not believe in them. Sandukht dismissed the concern, believing that discipline would eventually command belief. Yet, in quiet moments, he too noticed the difference. She lit the sacred fires, but she never watched them burn. Sandukht was 15 when the rumors reached the capital, a strange man, draped in foreign cloth, with eyes that bore both gentleness and flame, had begun preaching in the northern provinces. He spoke of one God, not many, of love and sacrifice, not lineage and power. The man, called Thaddeus by his followers, was gathering the outcasts, healing the sick, sharing meals with peasants and women, in a land soaked with hierarchy and ancient rules. His words stirred not only wonder but fear. Some called him a prophet, others a danger. The priests of the temple denounced him as a sorcerer, and Sandukht issued a decree to watch but not yet interfere. He preferred knowledge over reaction. But Thaddeus was not content to remain on the margins. His words, though simple, carried power. "There is a light that no fire can match," he said in villages. "A kingdom not of swords but of hearts." It was said he walked unarmed into bandit camps and left with followers. Mothers named their infants after him. And in time, even whispers of his message reached the royal court, first through a curious servant, then a converted merchant, and finally through the mind of Sandukht herself. She encountered his teachings not in the flesh, but in fragments, overheard passages, etched symbols, a worn parchment passed among handmaidens. The words spoke of a God who loved without demand, who died not for glory but for mercy. These ideas did not immediately convert her, but they lingered, like embers beneath ash, glowing unseen. The palace continued its daily rhythm, feasts, ceremonies, political negotiations with envoys from Rome and Parthia, but in Sandukht, a new rhythm had begun. She prayed in secret not to Ahura Mazda, but to a presence unnamed. She began to question the nature of power, the meaning of obedience, the purpose of suffering. Her tutors noticed a new fire in her. Her father noticed her increased silence. Sandukht, now deep into his second decade as king, sensed change not just in his daughter but in the air of Armenia itself. Crops grew with new abundance in certain regions where Thaddeus had visited. Tribes long divided found common cause under shared belief, and his spies reported that even some lower nobility were intrigued by the teachings of this Nazarene movement. The king found himself caught in an impossible position. Suppressing Thaddeus might provoke rebellion in the provinces. Embracing him risked the ire of Parthia and the collapse of the temple's influence. But what haunted Sandukht most was not the political consequence. It was the growing certainty that his daughter was listening to this prophet's call. He summoned her more frequently, asking questions masked as fatherly concern. What did she think of the gods? Did she believe loyalty was owed first to the throne or to truth? Did she find fulfillment in rituals? Sandukht answered carefully, never lying but never revealing. Yet her eyes spoke of distant horizons and her prayers became harder to conceal. In the third winter after Thaddeus' arrival, the snowfall came early, cloaking the capital in white silence. And it was during this stillness that Sandukht vanished for 3 nights. She returned before dawn on the 4th, cloaked in humility. Her hair still wet from baptism in the river beneath the cliffs. She said nothing of where she'd been, but something in her eyes had changed. The silence was gone. In its place, serenity. Sandukht, when he looked upon her that morning, felt the earth shift beneath his throne. He did not know yet what she had done. He did not know that she had pledged her soul to the God of Thaddeus. But he sensed, as kings often do, that something irreparable had occurred. His daughter, born during a storm, shaped by fire and duty, had chosen a path that would one day rend his kingdom in two, not by sword, but by spirit. The mountains around them had stood for millennia, unmoved by men and their empires. But now, deep within the stone, a crack had formed. It would take years to widen. But the first fracture, the whisper before the avalanche, had begun. And her name was Sandukht. In the shadows of the Armenian highlands, where the roads curved through forests of pine and the stones remembered ancient blood, a stranger walked without fear. He did not carry a sword, nor did he ride a stallion adorned in royal harness. Instead, he moved with sandals worn thin by miles and eyes that saw beyond the surface of kingdoms. He was called Thaddeus, and though few knew his origin, the stories that swirled around his name were like the wind, unseen yet everywhere. To the peasants of the northern valleys, he was a healer. To the outcasts, a friend. To the soldiers who heard his voice but could not silence their curiosity, he was an enigma. But to the spiritual guardians of the old world, the Zoroastrian priests, the tribal seers, the guardians of the fire temples, he was something far more dangerous. He was a flame they did not light and a voice they did not authorize. In Armenia, where religion had always been a mirror of the crown, where the gods stood beside kings and kings ruled with divine sanction, a new prophet meant more than a theological threat, it meant a crack in the mortar of control. The teachings of Thaddeus spread not by force but by resonance. His gospel was spoken in marketplaces and whispered in wine-houses, carried on the tongues of women at wells and passed in secret beneath tapestries of noble houses. He did not speak of political revolution, yet he dismantled the foundation of fear. He taught that every soul, regardless of birth or burden, held equal worth in the eyes of a God who had descended not to reign with might but to die in mercy. The very idea shattered centuries of order. Sandukht encountered his message not from the man himself, at least not yet, but from the tremors he left in his wake. A handmaiden whispered of a sermon she had overheard while visiting her brother in the borderlands. A letter smuggled through trade routes carried verses attributed to him. even a court musician. One skeptical and hardened by years of servitude spoke in hushed tones of seeing a leper cleansed simply by a touch and a prayer. These pieces, scattered and raw, began to form an image in Sandukht's mind, a portrait of a faith that did not demand sacrifice of lambs but of ego that did not burn incense to statues but lifted broken spirits toward a living God. She was still a princess and her life unfolded within the golden latticework of the palace. But her soul had begun to pace like a lion behind iron bars. Every feast felt hollow, every incense-laden ceremony perfunctory. She sat through council meetings and watched the men debate grain reserves and troop placements, but her heart was somewhere else. Walking barefoot in a field with a man she had never met, listening to words she had never been taught. Then, late one evening, as the palace settled into its quiet ritual of sleep, a servant slipped a thin parchment beneath her door. On it was a single line, written in a language she had only begun to study. With the help of her personal tutor, she translated the line into the tongue of her heart. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It was a thunderclap in the quiet. Not because it spoke of God. Armenia knew many gods, but because it did not speak of bloodlines or rituals or conquest. It spoke of inwardness, of purity not earned by birth but by choice. Sandukht did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, listening to the wind breathe through the cypress trees, and for the first time, felt that she was no longer alone in her hunger for truth. She began to seek more. Carefully, deliberately. A conversation with a merchant from Artashat who, under the guise of politics, recited verses from the Nazarene's teachings. A coded exchange with a nursemaid who had once served a family that secretly worshipped the one God. Even the records of foreign travelers held clues, scribes from Antioch, captains from Cappadocia, each adding color to the image of Thaddeus and his growing circle of believers. Sandukht, too, had his informants. He was not blind to the winds shifting beneath his throne. Reports arrived weekly, some of them red-stamped with urgency. Villages had begun to abandon fire temples. A handful of local chieftains had refused to attend the annual renewal rites, citing conscience. And most alarmingly, several young nobles had been caught gathering in candlelit rooms reciting prayers not approved by the temple. The king ordered surveillance, not yet arrests. He was a man of strategy, not impulse. But his concern deepened when the name of his daughter appeared not in accusation but in proximity. She had attended a music recital in a distant estate where several Christian sympathizers were later discovered. She had spoken favorably of philosophical unity during a public ceremony. She had been seen reading scrolls in languages not taught by the temple. Sandukht summoned her, under the guise of familial affection. He asked her about her studies, her beliefs, her thoughts on loyalty. She answered as she always did, with honesty cloaked in ambiguity. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw not the shadow of rebellion but the radiance of conviction. It unnerved him more than open defiance. Around this time, Sandukht began waking before dawn, slipping past the guards who had grown complacent with familiarity, and walking the outer gardens where commoners once brought offerings. There, beneath an ancient sycamore, she would sit in silence, whispering to a presence she could not see but had begun to feel more tangibly than all the marble and gold around her. Then, one morning, the unimaginable happened. A visitor came to the outer court, tattered robes, sun-darkened skin, and eyes that burned like coals beneath calm waters. He came not with fanfare but with humility. He asked no audience with the king, no favors from the nobility. He merely spoke to those who would listen. And it was whispered, like fire racing through dry grass, that this man was Thaddeus himself. Sandukht heard the rumor and felt the world narrow. The man whose voice had reshaped her soul without ever reaching her ears was now in her kingdom, within reach. She made inquiries through trusted servants. A day passed, then another, and on the third morning, a message arrived, hidden within the folds of her prayer mat. A location, a time, no signature. She prepared in secret. Cloaked in the garments of a maid, she slipped through hidden corridors and exited through a gate long forgotten by the palace guard. The sun was not yet up. The city still dreamed. In a grove outside the city walls where the river carved a shallow pool between rocks, she found him. Alone, kneeling, his hands immersed in the water as if listening to it. He looked up. Not surprised, not startled, but as one greeting a long-awaited guest. No words passed. None were needed. What passed between them in that hour was not recorded in any scroll. But its consequence would change a nation. She was baptized in the cold stream beneath the branches. The water clung to her like light. When she emerged, it was not with the ecstasy of revelation, but with the solemnity of resolve. She had not found comfort. She had found purpose. She returned before dawn, her hair damp, her eyes clear. She did not speak of where she had been. But everything about her had changed. Her steps were lighter, yet more grounded. Her words fewer, yet heavier with truth. She smiled not as one who is pleased, but as one who knows. And though none in the palace knew what had occurred, they felt its aftermath like the tremor after an unseen earthquake. The daughter of Sandukht, the princess of Armenia, had stepped beyond the veil of power and chosen something far more dangerous, faith. The palace continued as it always had, courts convened, soldiers trained. Incense burned, but beneath its stone walls, a new kingdom had been born. Not in rebellion, but in belief. Not in proclamation, but in baptism. And in the quiet heart of that kingdom stood Sandukht. No longer simply a daughter of the mountain king, but now a servant of a far greater king, whose throne was not of this world, and whose crown awaited only the fire of testing. The water had dried from her skin by the time she returned to the palace, but it remained in her bones. It was not the water itself that mattered, it was the covenant it carried. A silent vow carved deeper than blood, deeper than loyalty to crown or kin. Sandukht had crossed a threshold invisible to the eye yet blinding to the spirit. She was still draped in royal silks, still addressed as princess, still sat at the side of her father during council, but something in her had shifted in a way that could not be undone. She walked the halls not with pride but with clarity. Every gilded statue she passed, every flame that flickered in the temple's fire altars, now felt like a relic from a dream she had woken from. She did not disdain them. She simply no longer belonged to them. Her gaze no longer lingered on the rituals of the court. Instead, she began to see people, their suffering, their hunger for purpose, their weariness with pomp. She saw, for the first time, how much was hollow in a world polished with ceremony and rule. At first, no one noticed. Her demeanor remained graceful. She performed her duties, attended the festivals, responded to petitions. But those closest to her sensed something intangible, a stillness that was no longer merely the serenity of nobility but something weightier. Some found it unsettling. Others were drawn to it without understanding why. The transformation did not remain hidden long. A week after her baptism, she was summoned to a spring equinox celebration in the fire temple. The rites were precise, steeped in centuries of custom. She had participated many times before, offering incense, chanting the invocations to Ahura Mazda, bowing before the sacred fire. But that day, she hesitated. She stood before the flame, the priest beside her, the entire court watching. Her hand held the gold-tipped branch meant for the ceremonial lighting. Her lips parted. But the prayer did not come. The silence stretched. Whispers fluttered through the chamber like startled birds. Sandukht sat motionless on his throne, his gaze piercing. Then she placed the branch gently at the base of the altar, unburnt, and stepped back. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. She thanked the court for the honor of participation, bowed her head to the priest, and turned away. It was not rebellion. It was reverence reoriented. But to those who saw power in precision, it was a fracture, a defiance that could not be ignored. Rumors bloomed like wildflowers in a dry valley. The princess had refused the sacred flame. She had abandoned the rites. Some whispered she was ill. Others claimed madness. A few murmured of foreign sorcery. But among the quiet hearts who had already begun to hear the gospel of Thaddeus, the truth traveled faster than fear. Sandukht had joined them, not merely in spirit, but in covenant. Within days, she began receiving letters slipped beneath her chamber door or left within baskets of fruit, testimonies from women, servants, merchants who had also begun to believe. She responded not with proclamations but with quiet presence. She listened. She prayed. She counseled. Then came the moment of reckoning. Sandukht, ever a king of calculated restraint, had allowed her transformation to unfold without interference. But now, faced with public embarrassment and murmurs of treason, he acted. He summoned Sandukht in private. The room was silent but charged with centuries of tradition and the invisible weight of a father's fear. He did not ask her directly. Instead, he questioned her choices, her absences, her silences. her newfound associations. She answered with calm honesty. She had found a truth that no longer required ritual. She had found a love that surpassed obedience to custom. She still honored her father, but her soul no longer bowed to the old gods. Her words did not tremble. Her gaze did not waver. Sandukht dismissed her with a nod. He did not show anger. But inside, the world he had built was tilting. He had always known that faith could be dangerous, but he had not imagined it would come from within his own blood. That evening he convened his inner circle. Priests, generals, and counselors debated her fate. Some urged restraint. She was young, impressionable, misguided. Others demanded punishment. If the king's daughter could defy the sacred rites without consequence, the realm itself would unravel. Sandukht listened but said little. His face was carved in stone. Days passed. Sandukht was placed under quiet confinement, not as a prisoner but as a precaution. Her rooms were watched, her movements restricted, her visitors screened. Yet even in isolation, her faith deepened. She began to recite scripture aloud, not for others, but to fill the silence with the sound of grace. In the courtyard below her chamber, servants began to gather at odd hours, pretending to tend the flowers but straining to hear her voice. Her prayers became seeds, falling upon ears and germinating in hearts. Guards assigned to monitor her found themselves listening instead of watching. One wept, another requested a meeting in secret. Her solitude had become a sanctuary. Then, one afternoon, a child no more than 8 delivered a folded cloth to the palace gates. On it, stitched in careful thread, was a fish and a vine, symbols of the Nazarene faith. Beneath it, in careful hand, the words, "Thank you, my princess, for showing us the light." Sandukht received the cloth before Sandukht did. He studied it long into the night, unmoving. He was not a cruel man, but he was a king. He understood what symbols could do. This cloth was not merely gratitude, it was declaration. It was allegiance. He ordered Sandukht moved to a secluded tower, the one once used for foreign prisoners. Her chambers were stripped of silk, her books removed. She was given bread, water, and solitude, but they did not take her prayers. In the darkness, she sang psalms. In the cold, she recited the Beatitudes. In hunger, she gave thanks. And in her heart, she was not imprisoned. She was more free than she had ever been, no longer weighed down by protocol or pretense. She existed solely in the presence of God. Outside, the court bristled. Some sympathized. Others sharpened their knives. The fire priests demanded an example be made. The noble houses watched, wary of appearing disloyal but frightened by Sandukht's unshakable peace. And among the people, her name became legend. Not because she was a rebel, but because she was unafraid. Thaddeus, upon hearing of her imprisonment, did not weep. He merely prayed. He understood that the soil of Armenia had been seeded and Sandukht was its first flower. What would grow from her sacrifice? No empire could control. Winter descended. The mountains cloaked themselves in white and the rivers froze into silence. The tower stood isolated, wind-whipped, and still. But within its walls, the warmth of faith burned constant. And then, on a night when the moon rose red over the distant peaks, a servant, a boy of 16, risked death to leave a simple note outside her door. It bore no signature, only words she had once spoken aloud to no one in particular. Even chains cannot bind the spirit marked by heaven. She read it in the dark, tears rising not from fear but from gratitude. She was not alone. The kingdom may not yet see it, but a new kingdom was rising, not in rebellion, but in rebirth. Not of swords, but of souls. And she, a daughter once meant to inherit a throne of stone, had become the living temple of something far more eternal. The snows that cloaked Armenia in silence did not soften the coldness growing in the court of Sandukht. Winter no longer whispered solemn peace but instead carried the weight of a reckoning yet to come. Beneath the hush of frozen branches and glinting marble corridors, decisions were hardening like ice on mountain stone. Within the tower that held Sandukht, time became its own kingdom, measured not by bells or decrees, but by the rhythm of prayer and the slow unraveling of fear. Outside, unrest stirred. The nobles who once toasted to the crown's stability now met in anxious private. They saw the conflict not merely as a familial rift, but as a prelude to chaos. If the king could not command his own daughter, How could he command a fractured land balanced precariously between the ambitions of Rome and the shadows of Parthia? Faith, they whispered, was no longer private. It had become a contagion. And Sandukht was the patient zero. Sandukht sat alone more often, staring into the fire pits of the palace that once seemed sacred and now seemed judgmental. He could feel his empire tightening around him, not from invasion, but from within. The fire priests, emboldened by growing concern among the aristocracy, demanded decisive action. They reminded him that tolerance was not a virtue among kings. They cited scriptures older than memory, invoked the wrath of Ahura Mazda, and painted Sandukht's continued resistance as an omen of national collapse. And yet, despite the mounting voices, Sandukht hesitated. He visited the tower under cover of darkness, not as a ruler, but as a father. He stood outside the heavy oak door, listening. No guards accompanied him. Inside, his daughter was singing, not loudly, but with such clarity that it felt like moonlight poured into words. It was a hymn he did not recognize. It spoke not of conquest, but of mercy, not of order, but of grace. He felt his throat tighten, as if the very air resisted his breath. He did not knock. He did not enter. He simply turned away and walked back through snow without leaving footprints in his mind. But the kingdom would not wait. Word of Sandukht's imprisonment had spread far beyond the palace walls. In markets, potters and shepherds invoked her name in prayer. Soldiers, stoic and loyal, were heard reciting fragments of the teachings she had shared. In villages touched by Thaddeus's ministry, fires once sacred now burned untended. A different kind of flame had taken root, one without smoke, yet impossible to extinguish. Pressure mounted. The priests demanded a public trial. The generals warned of insubordination within the ranks. Even foreign envoys began to whisper of the instability within Armenia's core. Sandukht, surrounded by counsel yet alone in choice, called for a tribunal, not a spectacle but a hearing. A formality that might satisfy tradition while giving his daughter one last chance to recant. Sandukht was brought from the tower on the morning of the vernal equinox, escorted not in chains but in silence. Her garments were plain, not royal. Her posture was neither defiant nor submissive. She walked with the calm certainty of one who had already made peace with truth, even if it came at the cost of everything else. The tribunal convened in the Hall of Judgment, a chamber carved with the images of kings and gods, its ceiling a mosaic of fire and stars. The priests stood in ceremonial robes. The noble family sat in rings of gold and silk. Sandukht presided in silence. He wore no crown. Sandukht was asked to speak. She did not defend herself. She merely bore witness to the truth she had found, to the peace it had brought. To the God who had spoken not through thunder or edict, but through a carpenter's hands and a cross of shame. She spoke with no venom, no condemnation. Only light. Her words filled the hall not with rage, but with unease. Then came the question, would she renounce her belief and return to the old ways? To the fire altars, the rites of the temple. The obedience to crown and gods? She paused, not out of doubt, but out of love. Love for her father, who had once held her hand through corridors of power. Love for the people, many of whom feared change more than death. Love for the land itself, ancient and aching beneath centuries of sacrifice. And then, with the gentleness of falling snow, she said no. The hall was still. Sandukht did not flinch. He did not rage. He merely closed his eyes. The priests conferred among themselves, performing the ritual gestures, reciting the necessary invocations. The judgment was rendered quickly, death by royal decree, carried out in private, without spectacle. She would be given time to prepare, a mercy some claimed as dignity, others as delay. That night, as the stars wheeled over Mount Ararat and the owls called from the trees, Sandukht was returned to her cell. But she was no longer a prisoner. She had crossed yet another threshold. Death was no longer threat but offering. She wept not for herself, but for her father, whose heart bore a wound deeper than any blade could carve. Sandukht remained awake, seated at the edge of his chamber, surrounded by silence. He replayed her words, her serenity, her refusal, not born of rebellion, but born of allegiance to something he could not command. He remembered her birth, her childhood laughter, the way she had once asked why the stars did not fall. And now she was to be extinguished like a star, because the gods of old could not bear her light. He considered delaying the execution, but knew it would only feed unrest. He considered exile, but knew her legend would grow unchecked. He considered clemency, but knew it would be seen as weakness. He was not merely a father. He was a king, and the king must guard the boundary between order and oblivion. Still, he waited 3 days, perhaps hoping, perhaps dreading. During that time, Sandukht fasted. She prayed. She wrote letters not of farewell, but of encouragement, to believers, to doubters, even to those who condemned her. She offered forgiveness without demand. She prepared not for death, but for union. Then came the morning chosen for her end. She was led to a grove outside the palace grounds, a place once reserved for royal hunts, now quiet with the blooming of early spring. The sky was clear, the earth soft. A small group gathered, not a crowd, but witnesses. A handful of priests. A few guards. A single scribe. Sandukht did not attend. Sandukht did not resist. She knelt upon the earth, hands open, eyes lifted, not to the mountains, but beyond them. Her last words were not recorded. They were too quiet. But the wind carried them, and those who heard said they were like a prayer written in the language of trees and rivers and all things eternal. The blow was swift. Her body fell, but something else rose. Those who stood there that morning would later say they felt it, a presence, a weight lifted, a silence that did not oppress but embraced. Some wept. Others simply stood, unable to move. The scribe, tasked with recording only facts, left his scroll blank. Sandukht was gone. But the kingdom she had spoken of, the faith she had planted, the light she had carried, those things remained. And they began to grow. In secret, her followers took her body, buried it not in royal tombs, but in earth softened by prayer. Over time, that place would become sacred ground, and her name, once whispered in fear, would one day be sung in cathedrals of stone and soul. Sandukht, when he learned of her death, said nothing. He dismissed his court, closed his doors, and for 3 days saw no one. When he emerged, his face had changed. Not with age, but with something heavier. He ruled for many more years. But he never spoke her name again. And yet, she was never absent. For in every village where the gospel found voice, in every soul who chose light over fear, in every heart that refused to bow to power without truth, there Sandukht lived. And her trial, born of blood and fire, became the cornerstone of a kingdom not built by hands, but by hope. The body of Sandukht was gone, buried beneath layers of earth beyond the palace walls. Her blood soaked into soil older than empires. Yet her presence remained, thick in the air, woven into the silence of the corridors she once walked. Those who had feared her defiance now feared her absence even more, for in her death she had become uncontainable. No longer bound by tower walls or royal decrees, her story moved freely through the land, whispered, wept over, repeated until it became scripture in hearts not yet knowing they had become altars. The guards who had escorted her in her final days did not speak of what they saw, but their eyes bore the weight of it. The captain of the palace garrison, once rigid in duty, now lingered longer in prayer before beginning his rounds, gazing toward the hills where she had fallen. The kitchen maid who had once feared punishment for praying silently in Sandukht's chamber now lit candles in the pantry, arranging them in quiet defiance as though waiting for her princess to return. Among the common people, the story evolved not as a rebellion but as a revelation. She was not described as a dissenter but as a vessel of light. A woman who had dared to say no not for pride but for truth. In villages nestled in the folds of the mountains, mothers named their daughters after her. In the vineyards and pastures, farmers etched crosses into stones. Shepherds began carrying carved symbols sewn into their garments. They no longer belonged to the temple alone, they now belonged to a kingdom of conscience. Inside the palace, Sandukht returned to governance with the efficiency that had made his reign long and his borders respected. Treaties were renewed. Trade resumed. Envoys from Rome and Parthia once again paid tribute in gold and words. But something had altered in the fabric of rule. The weight of power had grown heavier. The rituals more hollow. The throne itself seemed colder, as if the stones beneath it remembered what had been done. The fire priests, emboldened by the apparent restoration of order, pressed for further purges. They demanded the identification of all who had communicated with Thaddeus. They encouraged the king to root out the sect before it spread further, citing sacred law and ancestral tradition. But Sandukht, to their surprise, hesitated. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was weariness, or perhaps it was something deeper, something he would never admit. He had killed his daughter to protect his kingdom, and yet the very foundation of that kingdom had shifted. The stability they claimed had returned was illusion. Beneath the polished surface of obedience, something older than law and stronger than fire had begun to pulse. In the dungeons, where once petty criminals languished, now sat men and women accused of belief. Their crimes were not theft or treason, but quiet allegiance to a crucified God. They did not curse their captors. They sang. They whispered prayers that traveled through stone walls and into the bones of guards. Some of those assigned to watch them began asking questions. Simple, sincere questions not of rebellion, but of meaning. Among those imprisoned was a woman named Siren, a former court scribe who had once copied royal decrees. She had heard Sandukht speak only once, from a balcony above the courtyard. But that one moment had turned her life. She had followed the teachings in secret, baptizing her children in mountain streams. When arrested, she went peacefully. Now in her cell, she began teaching others. She spoke not of overthrow but of mercy. She reminded the prisoners that Sandukht had died not as a symbol of defiance but as a witness to truth. Chains cannot bind the spirit, she whispered each evening before sleep, and those words became a chant that passed between cells, between hearts. The underground church began to form, not in cathedrals or basilicas, but in kitchens and caverns, behind goat pens and within orchard groves. Bread and wine were shared, not in banquet halls, but in corners of silence where memory and hope became sacraments. They called themselves not martyrs, but followers of the way. Thaddeus, ever a step ahead of persecution, moved cautiously through the countryside. He knew Sandukht's death had changed everything. He no longer needed to speak aloud to gather attention. Her story was already doing the work. In each village he visited, he was met not as a stranger, but as a shepherd returning to his flock. The people did not ask him for miracles. They asked him for understanding. How could a faith born from death become a path to life? How could suffering be strength? And Thaddeus told them again and again the truth that Sandukht had lived and died for. That the kingdom of God did not rise on thrones or swords, but on forgiveness, on the turning of hearts, on the light no darkness could contain. Back in the palace, Sandukht's inner circle frayed. Some advisors whispered discontent, calling for a return to harsh measures. Others, secretly moved by the persistence of the new faith, began withdrawing from public life, retreating into quiet contemplation. The king found himself increasingly alone, not merely in chambers but in thought. The weight of what he had done pressed into every moment of solitude. When he visited the fire temple, the flames seemed colder. When he walked the gardens, the wind carried echoes of hymns never sung aloud before. One night, sleepless and haunted, Sandukht walked to the tower where Sandukht had been held. It had been sealed since her death, the guards reassigned, the chambers undisturbed. He ordered it opened. No servants accompanied him. He entered alone. The room was as she had left it, bare, quiet, faintly scented with oil and earth. On the wall, etched in soot with the edge of a charcoal shard, was a single phrase. It was in the language of the Christians, yet he recognized it. He had seen it in the note once brought to her door. He read it aloud to the silence. Even chains cannot bind the spirit marked by heaven. He stood there for a long time, the words refusing to leave him. He did not weep. Kings were not taught to weep. But his hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in years he knelt, not in prayer, but in remembrance. He left the room without sealing it. From that day forward, the tower remained unlocked. No one was assigned to guard it. Yet pilgrims began appearing quiet, respectful, leaving tokens at the threshold. A sprig of rosemary, a scrap of linen, a single pearl. They did not linger. They simply knelt, whispered, and departed. The guards did not stop them. The king did not speak of them. Armenia continued to function as a kingdom. The roads remained clear, the granaries full, the borders protected. But beneath the surface, the soul of the land was changing. 1,000 quiet revolutions bloomed each day, in words whispered between mother and son, in hands washed clean before prayer, in candles lit where no one watched. And through it all, Sandukht lived on. Not as a specter, not as a martyr carved in stone, but as breath, as rhythm, as the living memory of a fire that could not be smothered. She had died in obedience to a truth no man could decree, and in doing so she had cracked the foundation of empires. The kingdom of Armenia moved forward as if nothing had changed. but those who looked closely could see the fracture lines beneath its surface. The capital remained majestic. The council convened with ceremony, and the fire temples blazed as they always had. Yet in every town square, every market stall, and every remote farm nestled against the mountains, the memory of Sandukht whispered through the silence. The flame of her sacrifice had not died. It had simply scattered, splintering into thousands of smaller lights, carried in the hands and hearts of those who had heard her name spoken in reverence, who had found courage in her refusal, and who now saw themselves reflected in her quiet resistance. The sword had fallen, but the cross remained upright. Sandukht continued to rule with precision, with eyes that missed nothing and lips that rarely opened without intent. To the world outside, he remained the unshakable king, a man of borders, of strategy, of balanced alliances between Rome and Parthia. But within, something had shifted, not like a collapse, but like erosion, silent, relentless, shaping the man who wore the crown from the inside out. He found no rest. Nights grew longer, dreams stranger. He saw her not in terror but in stillness. Sandukht, standing barefoot in snow that did not melt, singing words he could not understand. In one dream, she stood at the edge of a great river, holding out her hand, not in accusation but in invitation. He would wake in darkness, breath caught, palms open as if reaching for something he no longer knew how to grasp. He stopped attending the fire temple regularly. Instead, he walked alone in the palace gardens or sat before empty scrolls. He penned nothing. He burned incense that did not ease him. He listened to ministers without hearing their words. The voices around him praised his foresight, his control, his steadiness. But none dared speak of his daughter, and none dared question the emptiness that grew behind his eyes. The fire priests, sensing his detachment, took greater initiative. They issued new decrees condemning heresy. They increased temple patrols. They publicly denounced the cult of the crucified one, as they began to call it. But for every punishment they imposed, a new name appeared in the growing list of those willing to follow Sandukht's path. Peasants, bakers, nobles, even members of the royal guard. What Sandukht had hoped would end with one execution now bloomed in defiance of reason. He had acted as king, yet he had ignited something the law could not suppress. The more the priests railed, the more the people listened, not to them, but to the stories carried from lips to ear in the quiet hours of dawn. And then a letter arrived, not from an enemy, but from a Roman official stationed in Cappadocia, an old ally. It warned of unrest stirring not from foreign agents, but from within the soul of the land itself. The name of his daughter was being whispered beyond Armenia's borders. Her execution had not gone unnoticed. Among the Christian communities rising in the East, she was being hailed not just as a martyr, but as a saint. Sandukht read the letter in solitude. He did not react, but after sealing it, he ordered no response. He folded the parchment twice, placed it beneath a stone in the garden, and walked away. That same week, a trader from the province of Agsnik was brought before the court for refusing to offer incense at a public festival. When questioned, he confessed, not in fear but with pride, that he followed the teachings of Christ, that he had heard Sandukht speak in a dream, that she had told him not to bow to fire but to truth, that her face had been lit with light no altar could replicate. Sandukht dismissed the court. He stood alone in the grand hall, where murals of the gods stretched across vaulted ceilings and the scent of burning cedar lingered in the air. He remembered holding Sandukht as a child in that very room. She had once touched the murals, asking if gods could be painted with enough love to become real. He had laughed then. He did not laugh now. That night he called no guards. He walked into the now abandoned tower where she had been held. The door creaked open to reveal only dust and silence. Yet it felt more holy than the temple. On the floor, still visible, were the marks of knees pressed in repeated prayer. On the wall, the soot-marked phrase remained, "Even chains cannot bind the spirit marked by heaven." He sat on the floor and stayed there until dawn. The next morning, he did something no one expected. He ordered the release of prisoners held for faith. Not publicly, quietly, no announcement, but dozens were unshackled and allowed to vanish into the hills. He told no one why. The ministers who received the orders obeyed in stunned silence, unsure whether to question or simply accept the king's grief as command. It was the first visible crack. News of the releases spread quickly. Followers of the Way did not proclaim it as victory. They received it with awe and prayer. The underground churches grew bolder. More letters circulated bearing Sandukht's name. More symbols of the fish and the vine were carved into doorposts. And still, no decree from Sandukht reversed it. The fire priests were furious. They confronted the king in the royal court. They demanded clarity. They accused him of wavering, of abandoning the gods who had sustained Armenia for generations. Sandukht listened, then stood. He said nothing. He simply walked out. It was the last time he entered the temple. From that moment, the power of the old order began to wane. The priests still held rituals, still lit fires, but the people came with less fervor. Many came out of habit, but their hearts had turned elsewhere. And behind every liturgy, the memory of Sandukht stood, not as an interruption, but as the new lens through which everything else was now seen. Sandukht ruled for several more years, but with increasing solitude. He saw fewer advisors, issued fewer laws. He spent his days walking the mountain paths outside the city, always alone, always silent. Those who passed him did not speak. They bowed, but he did not return the gesture. His eyes were fixed on something far away. Some said he had gone mad. Others believed he had begun to repent. Still others believed he was waiting, perhaps for the voice of his daughter in dreams, or for a sign from the God she had chosen. He never converted. Not publicly. No one ever heard him recite Christian prayers. But in the final years of his life, he forbade any further executions for belief. He halted the persecution. He allowed silence to speak where once swords had ruled. And in that silence, the cross spread. By the time Sandukht lay on his deathbed, the fire temple still burned. But the people's hearts burned brighter with something new. The name of Sandukht had passed beyond legend. She was no longer merely remembered. She was invoked. The sword had fallen. The cross had remained. And the king who had once tried to preserve the old world by killing his daughter died in a new one, shaped by her witness, softened by her mercy, and forever haunted by the light he could never put out. The death of Sandukht did not shake the earth. There were no uprisings, no political crisis, no dramatic struggle for succession. The court moved swiftly, elevating a cousin of noble lineage to the throne, one favored by the fire priests and acceptable to the Parthian governors who still regarded Armenia as a buffer, not a beacon. The new king, cautious and politically astute, spoke the expected words, performed the ancestral rites, and paid homage to both gods and tradition. To the world outside, it was continuity. But something had changed, not in banners or bloodlines, but in the breath of the land itself. The name of Sandukht no longer belonged to whispers. Her story had crossed the borders of fear and become something more enduring, liturgical, lit up in memory and in meaning. She had once knelt in a tower cell and whispered psalms into silence. Now those same verses were chanted in groves, in caves, in kitchens, in the hearts of shepherds and nobles alike. The girl they had killed was no longer a heretic. She was a saint. There was no official canonization. No church had yet risen to claim her. No bishop raised a hand to declare her holy. And yet she was venerated. Her burial site, once an unmarked patch of earth on the hillside, became a place of pilgrimage. Small crosses began to appear, carved in stone, traced in ash. The faithful came barefoot, often under the veil of night, laying rosemary sprigs and pieces of cloth at the edge of the soil. Some came seeking healing. Others came only to sit, to weep, to remember. From these gatherings, the first shape of the Armenian church began to take form. It was not yet a building. It was not yet a hierarchy. It was a presence, moving among the people like a wind through the orchard. It was songs sung in the fields where the temple priests never trod. It was the washing of hands before meals, done not for custom but in reverence. It was bread broken in silence, wine poured with trembling, and eyes lifted to the sky, not out of fear of wrath, but in longing for grace. Thaddeus, the stranger who had brought the gospel to Armenia, remained in the land for some time after Sandukht's passing. He was older now, his beard streaked with white, his steps slower. But he smiled more. He saw the fruit of what had once been seeds scattered by risk and watered in martyrdom. He visited Sandukht's burial site only once, according to tradition. He did not pray aloud. He merely knelt, laid his hands on the earth, and wept without sound. He did not say her name, but those who stood at a distance knew whom he mourned. And when he rose, they said his eyes had changed, that he no longer looked like a man burdened with a mission, but like a father who had seen his child finish what he began. After that, he vanished. Some say he returned westward, back toward the cities where the apostles once walked. Others say he died in the hills, his grave known only to the stars. But his absence was not loss. The faith no longer needed a single voice. It had found thousands. Within a decade of Sandukht's death, the underground churches became too numerous to track. They emerged not in rebellion, but in refuge, hidden from state view, yet open to all who sought a truth deeper than politics or piety. Led by elders, some former servants, some scribes, some women who had once been midwives or musicians, they formed a network of belief that no royal decree could dissolve. In the capital itself, where once the temple fires had burned without competition, small gatherings began to appear in abandoned gardens and under the floors of merchant houses. The nobles who had once dined with Sandukht now hosted prayers in secret. One widow whose son had served in the palace guard turned her wine cellar into a chapel. A carpenter's son, who had witnessed Sandukht's trial, carved crosses into wooden amulets and passed them hand to hand. And in these spaces, the memory of Sandukht was not frozen in tragedy. It was alive. She was spoken of as Tanyahai, not only as martyr, but as one who bore, a bearer of light, of burden, of bridge between the kingdoms of earth and heaven. The old gods still held their place in public life. The fire priests continued their rituals. The new king attended their ceremonies. But fewer eyes looked to the flames with wonder. Children asked different questions. Women hummed unfamiliar melodies. Markets rang with stories not of gods and warriors, but of a girl who had died without hatred and whose voice still warmed the marrow of the mountains. The fire priests responded as they always had, with suspicion, with edicts, with quiet repression. But the effect was limited. The people no longer feared as they once had. They had seen a daughter of kings fall beneath the sword and rise in the hearts of thousands. What threat could surpass that? What began as a movement of the lowly began to touch every layer of society. Even the scribes of the royal archives began to record not just laws and lineage, but strange tales of healings, of dreams, of night watches where lights appeared above homes. One particularly bold chronicler included a full page about Sandukht in the royal annals, cloaked in metaphor but unmistakable in meaning. The page was eventually removed, but not before copies were made, hidden in jars, passed along trade routes, committed to memory. The Armenian people had always been a people of survival. They had endured the pressures of empires, the weight of mountain winters, the shifting loyalties of neighbors. But now, for the first time, they had found a story that was not merely about enduring, but about being changed, about being made new. And that change had a face. It had a name. It had once knelt in a tower cell, wrapped not in gold, but in prayer. Sandukht was no longer just a name whispered in devotion. She had become the first saint of a people who would one day become the first nation to embrace Christianity not in secret, but as a covenant, as an identity, as a gift. The kingdom of Sandukht had tried to preserve the old order by silence. But in silence, the church was born, and in the ghost of a daughter, a faith found its voice. The memory of Sandukht faded slowly from the stones of the palace. His name remained inscribed on ceremonial walls, his likeness preserved in mosaic floors and golden coins. But his reign was remembered less for its diplomacy and more for its shadow, the silence he left behind, and the daughter he tried to erase from history. As years passed and the fire temples continued their rituals without the awe of earlier generations, the question grew louder, though it was rarely asked aloud. Had Armenia already shifted beneath their feet? The kings who followed Sandukht were cautious, seeking balance rather than vision. They offered sacrifices to the fire gods while tolerating, if not endorsing, the rise of the Nazarene faith. They spoke in both languages, the old tongue of the priests and the new whispers of a faith that had survived execution, exile, and silence. Yet in this duality, they underestimated the tide. It did not come in fury. It came like the snowmelt, quiet, persistent, changing the shape of every river it touched. The grave of Sandukht, once visited by a handful of believers under moonlight, had become a place of pilgrimage. Still unmarked by any official structure, it grew into a sanctuary defined not by walls but by presence. Travelers came from distant provinces, from the southern valleys and northern ridges, drawn by rumor and reverence. Some came seeking healing for bodies. Others came to bury the weight of grief. All left transformed, not by spectacle, but by something far deeper. They spoke of peace that passed understanding. They spoke of her spirit. And slowly the church took form. It began in song. Hymns composed by shepherds who had never seen a manuscript carried melodies across mountain passes. It moved in symbols, crosses carved into stone, fish drawn beneath benches. Loaves broken with hands unwashed by ritual. It found its anchor in memory, in the death of a girl who had refused to lie, in the love of a teacher who had chosen a cross over a throne, and in the lives of men and women who now chose faith over fear. By the time the third generation after Sandukht came of age, the underground church was no longer hidden. It had no official buildings, but it had leaders, men and women with knowledge passed through fire and wilderness, trained not in temples but in tenacity. They baptized openly in rivers. They taught children stories of martyrs and miracles. They celebrated feasts not of kings, but of resurrection. And though the kingdom still bore the names of its old gods, its heart had shifted. Among the fire priests, panic grew. They had survived invasions, dynastic changes, and the loss of royal favor, but this was something different. This was not rebellion. This was transformation. No temples had been destroyed, no altars defiled, but their fires burned without belief. They were flames without fuel, echoing rites that no longer resonated with the people. For each chant recited, there was a child who could no longer explain its meaning. For every sacred offering, there was a mother teaching her children the Beatitudes by memory. One high priest, in desperation, demanded a royal edict to outlaw the Christian gatherings. But the king, though loyal in public, refused. He feared what the people might do if he tried to extinguish what had become a movement of heart. He had seen, even in his own household, the mark of this faith. His sister, once a loyal sponsor of the temple, now hosted gatherings in her estate. His advisors spoke more often of peace and less of conquest. Even the palace guards crossed themselves in secret before battle. Armenia, still officially bound to the gods of fire and empire, was no longer theirs. And through it all, Sandukht's name endured. She was remembered not just as the first to die for Christ in Armenia, but as the first to live fully for him. Her life, brief as it had been, became the template. Her voice, though silenced by sword, continued in stories. Young women invoked her as they faced forced marriages or cultural expectation. Old men recalled her courage as they passed down their faith to sons born into uncertainty. And for the poor, those forgotten by both temple and crown, she was one of them. A princess, yes, but more so, a sister in suffering. Legends grew as legends do. Some said that flowers bloomed year-round at her burial site. Others claimed that water from a nearby stream healed the sick. One tale said that a blind child saw light for the first time while kneeling at her grave. Whether these stories were true was not the point. They were believed not because they sounded possible, but because they felt real. And in the mystery of belief, a nation began to reimagine itself. The old stories of fire gods, of tribal vengeance, of kings carved from marble no longer sufficed. A new story was needed, one that made room for tears and hope, for weakness transformed into strength. One that could cradle the suffering of a people squeezed between two empires, and still offer something eternal. Sandukht's story became that anchor. In villages across the kingdom, small wooden churches began to rise. At first they were mistaken for barns, simple and unadorned. But inside, the walls echoed with scripture, with prayer, with song. They bore no banners of kings, no images of conquest. Only the cross, only the light. And still, no one forgot that she had been the daughter of a king. This fact became its own message, that truth could grow in a palace and still bloom in a prison. That a crown could not protect against sacrifice. That royalty did not immunize one from the call of faith. And perhaps most of all, that the love of God could reach even into the most fortified towers and call a soul to kneel. As the century turned, and Rome's grip on the region wavered, the Christian Church of Armenia had become not just a network of believers, but a culture, a heartbeat, a second skin. And though no public declaration had yet been made, it was clear to all who watched, Armenia was not becoming Christian. It already was. A bishop writing from the city of Edessa recorded it this way. There is in the land of Ararat a memory that walks. She was slain by her father, but she rose in the children. She is the prophecy they never wrote and the church they never built. She is Sandukht. And she is Armenia. And as winter came again to the mountains, cloaking the valleys in silence, the people did not fear the cold. They had known a colder sword, and it had failed. They had seen death, and it had taught them to live. In the flicker of candlelight, in the hush of evening prayers, in the footsteps of pilgrims climbing toward a nameless grave, one truth stood. The martyr's legacy had become the nation's soul. Snow blanketed the earth the morning it was declared. Not by trumpet, not by proclamation read aloud from palace balconies, not by decree etched in stone or shouted from the mouths of heralds, but by the quiet astonishment of the people themselves. The king, Tiridates III, born decades after Sandukht's martyrdom, a warrior once bent to Rome and Parthian influence alike, had knelt in silence and confessed Christ, not in whispers, not in the dark, but in the light of day. It was as if a dam had burst. Though the river had long since begun to carve its path in secret, the Christian faith was no longer an underground current. It surged into full daylight, flooding the valleys and climbing the slopes. And no edict from man could slow its course. Armenia, proud, mountainous, ancient, became the first nation in the world to embrace Christianity as the soul of its people, not as rebellion, but as inheritance. It was a choice born not in ambition but in repentance. For Tiridates, who had once persecuted Christians with the fury of a man trying to erase his own shadows, the road to faith came through fire. It came through illness, through visions, through the persistent witness of a man called Gregory, the one they called the Illuminator, the son of a traitor who would become the apostle of a nation. And yet, behind the story of Gregory, behind the conversion of a king, behind the cathedral stones that began to rise on hills once ruled by fire temples, there remained another story, quieter, older, deeper. The story of a girl. The story of Sandukht. She had no crown when she died, no army at her back, no nation at her feet. She had knelt alone in a tower cell. She had sung psalms through barred windows. She had looked into the face of death not with fear, but with conviction. Her grave had no monument, her bones not kept in golden reliquaries. And yet, it was her voice, stilled by a father's sword, that had first broken the silence. Now her voice was everywhere. In every church built from mountain stone, there was a corner set aside for her memory. In every baptism her name was spoken. The cross she bore in the dark had become a banner raised in daylight. Her death, once hidden in shame, was now told in schools, in hymns, in liturgies. Artists painted her not in torment, but in triumph. Always kneeling, always radiant, always free. Pilgrims came in greater numbers now, not just from Armenia but from far-off regions, Cappadocia, Antioch, even Rome. They walked for weeks, drawn not by power but by testimony. At the place where her body was once laid, a simple chapel was raised, stone upon stone, with an open roof that allowed the stars to watch over her, as if the heavens themselves refused to forget. The people called her many things: the first flame, the mountain bride, the daughter of light, but always they called her Tanuhai, the one who bore. She had borne the cross before they knew its meaning. She had carried the weight of truth before they understood its cost. She had walked the valley of death not with despair, but with hope. And in her wake, a people had awakened. Even the fire priests, those who remained, now walked different paths. Some clung to tradition, retreating to remote places where the old ways still breathed. But others, witnesses of the change, converted. They carried their knowledge of song, of scripture, of sacred rhythms into a new faith, transforming the bones of the past into the living breath of the future. In the generations that followed, Armenia would know many trials. Invasions, famines, earthquakes. Kingdoms would rise and fall. Kings would come and go. The cathedrals built in her name would be burned and rebuilt. Her image would be hidden during persecutions and restored during revivals. But she remained, not in walls but in witness, not in titles but in truth. Every time a girl chose prayer over fear, Sandukht lived. Every time a man forgave instead of cursed, Sandukht spoke. Every time the church lit a candle in a child's hand and said, "This is the light of Christ," it echoed the fire she once bore in secret. In the end, it was not the crown that defined Armenia. It was the cross. And it was not a king who carried it first. It was a daughter who sang through iron, who bled without hatred, who forgave as she fell. She had not set out to change a nation. She had only set out to be faithful. But in doing so, she had become the cornerstone of a kingdom not of this world. Now, as the bells rang from monasteries clinging to cliffsides, and as the smoke from incense curled into morning air above villages waking to prayer, her name was not mourned. It was celebrated. And the crown she wore was not gold. It was eternal.